Welcome to the third day of the 2023 Moqui conference. First session today will be by Lawrence Tran, our Tech Odyssey. He's at a company called Noggin, who provides services and systems for brand companies. And this is a fairly common pattern for users of Moqui who are designing and sometimes manufacturing, but often outsourcing the manufacturing of their products and then selling both retail and wholesale. And Noggin does this on behalf of quite a number of clients, but I'll let Lawrence get into what their experiences have been and so on. So I'll hand it over to you, Lawrence.
Great, thanks, David. So my talk today is going to be kind of our tech journey. So I kind of labeled the talk our Tech Odyssey and charted journey to and through Moqui. So who am I? My name is Lawrence Tran. I'm the CTO at Noggin, and I've been developing software from a systems and architecture perspective for over 2 decades. I'm a tech nerd at heart, so I'm still pretty involved in a lot of kind of day-to-day activities, pretty deep in there, doing architecture, code reviews, things like that. And I kind of like things all tech. So kind of a brief history of our company. We started out as a company called Brand Online, and we did end-to-end services for in the e-commerce space. And one of our main goals was kind of building out technology so that fashion brands and kind of less sophisticated companies can really get online and sell their products to shoppers and leave all that complication and that mess to us and let them kind of focus on what they do best, their brands, their products, and things like that. We did have a marketing aspect and a marketing component to it as well from an online perspective. So that's one of the areas we did assist in as well. Our initial platform that we had built was on the Magento 1 series platform, and we kind of built it in a way where it was a scalable solution where we could deploy multiple stores within our infrastructure and do it in a way where it was let's say scalable from a traffic perspective, scalable from a business operations perspective, and it really, I would say it was quite unique at the time. That the SaaS model was just kind of coming out, and the interesting part is as we kind of took meetings with different clients and tech people, even the Magento folks, they're kind of curious how we were doing some of the things because they weren't able to solve some of the issues that we ended up getting through. So things were pretty good. We had a playbook, this platform. We would build features and we'd be able to deploy it out to our clients in a kind of sustainable way. And it was working pretty well. I don't put real numbers in here, but just to give you an idea, like our costs were managed to a decent level. Our growth was good, and things looked like they were good, right? They're good until they're not. So you get to the point where there's always things that go on and things that are somewhat predictable, but it's one of those things you don't realize how much of an issue it is until you're faced with it. So one of the things that we got challenged with was Magento was doing a big shift, at least the Magento community, and then I would say the stewards of the Magento code base in a sense. So they were planning to end of life the 1.0 branch. That was, we made significant investments in that area, and it was kind of a daunting task to switch over to the 2.0 version. And the cost would be high from a development perspective, and we kind of found that a lot of the new features and things that were in 2.0, while they were good, I would say a lot of the core features that we wanted to do and kind of the fixes and adaptations that we had done were still inherent in the the framework. So, we kind of evaluated a couple different things. Does it make sense to be in this space anymore? Does it make sense? And the burden and the load to own and operate a front end is pretty significant. And when from a scaling perspective, from a cybersecurity perspective, from a compliance perspective, it's pretty high. So it's almost like it got to a point where it really didn't make sense to play in that front end space anymore. So we wanted to pivot, put a quote down here, all failure is failure to adapt. All success is successful adaptation. And that kind of resonated true for us at the time. We saw, hey, we had a change because to make this big switch, our costs would be high. There's kind of a lot of unknowns at the time. So what did that really mean? We took some time to really decide, hey, what was going on, and look at the marketplace and look at where some of the complexities lie in the way that we operated some of these brands and businesses. And we kind of came to the conclusion that a lot of it, the front end, was starting to be commoditized. This is the advent of Shopify, BigCommerce, all these other, WooCommerce, things like that. We're kind of coming up. People, especially with Shopify, I don't know how to describe it better than saying they kind of diminish the value of the complexity of running a front end. And from a business perspective, it makes complete sense. So, looking at that, looking at those headwinds, and also looking at where we also provide value, we pivoted more towards managing the middle in a sense. So there's tons of, as a lot of you may know, a lot of activities that happen to support e-commerce business. So pulling down orders, shipping them, managing inventory, kind of getting all those pieces together was still challenging and still a problem that needed to be solved. So, we did seek out to figure out how to do this a little bit better. And at this point, we were looking to do it on some new technology because the old one was essentially being deprecated. So at the time, we did, build that stuff on open source technology. So the first one was Magento. We used Elasticsearch. We did, the standard things. We were using Squid. We were using a bunch of different pieces in the mix here. So we wanted to look for something similar. We want to look for something that was open source, something that had a lot of capabilities available out of the box initially, and then something with a more modern tech stack and something where our team could adapt to pretty quickly. So transferring whatever knowledge we could from a business perspective into whatever technology, say code, was one of the goals as well. And, as we're kind of evaluating the landscape at the time, this is probably 2017, 2018 or so. We looked at the common, I guess, the usual suspects for what was available in the marketplace. So, Magento 2.0, obviously I mentioned we did look at that. It didn't look as appealing for us. So kind of that was a tough sell for us because a lot of the core fundamental pieces that we disliked about Magento weren't really solved. And we figured, hey, why are we gonna upgrade to something that kind of gives us, spend a lot of time and effort that gives us kind of the same problems as we had before? We looked at, because Magento's PHP, we have a lot of people that were familiar with PHP. So we looked at something like a framework like Laravel. But as we kind of went through that, we realized, hey, this is while it's a good framework, there's not a lot of pre-built business functionality in there. It is a very strong tool set for developers to use, but like I mentioned, not too much in the realm of business logic baked into the system. And I'm sure there's probably other frameworks based off of Laravel that could could probably do those things. It really wasn't suitable for kind of what we were thinking about. And then on the same vein, we did look at Django. Myself, I have some history with Django and Python, so we did kind of take a look at those, seeing if we could use that framework. But ultimately, those two were a little bit too raw for what we're kind of hoping to get out of it. And then, if you guys are familiar with Spree is a e-commerce frame or platform that does have, I think, a pretty quite robust feature set. And I believe a lot of different e-commerce, either companies or big businesses, have used them in the past. So it seemed appealing, because that was kind of the social proof that said, hey, this is something that does work. But one of the challenges we ultimately realized was, Ruby, the Ruby expertise within our company was pretty limited. So, that kind of fell by the wayside. And then we started looking at kind of Java-based systems. So Elastic Path, Broadleaf, those guys had some very interesting, I would say, technologies. Their websites had a very markety vibe to it, but the tech underneath seemed to be a little bit newer, and I couldn't tell how, what their install base really looked like, what the usage was, and how many people were actually leveraging this stuff in the back end. So those were interesting things, kind of like, I'd say, the shiny objects of the search in a sense. And then there was OFBiz, and what the story there was, my boss at the time, he had worked on OFBiz, or he used OFBiz in a previous kind of engagement with the company, and they were running e-commerce. They're running I believe some of their ERP applications in there, and they were able to scale it to a fairly decent level. And he was kind of describing I would say, the robustness, the predictability of kind of building things out with that as a framework. So that was one of the pieces that are frameworks that we looked at. While we're looking at that, we did talk to a couple different people in the industry. The common suspects for that as well, for implementations, Hotwax guys. They kind of came around and showed us what they had for that. It was kind of interesting. And since my boss did work on some OFBiz stuff, he did kind of cross paths with David Jones. So he kind of mentioned a story about them struggling with implementation or struggling with some of maybe the scaling issues. And he said that he noticed someone in the forums always answering the questions right, always getting right to the point and solving the issues, and happened to be David. So he reached out to him to help consult on the project, and kind of talked about his experience there. So we ended up reaching out to David as well, just kind of talk about maybe seeing if we could leverage him for OFBiz. But as we did meet with him, he introduced us to Moqui. So at that time, I would say this is about end of 2017, maybe beginning of 2018 or so. He gave us an introduction to Moqui. It was quite interesting because it was different than what we saw with OFBiz. OFBiz at the time seemed very robust, but it seemed like the tech was a little bit dated for some of our taste at the time. Moqui at the time had, they implemented, we had, Elasticsearch, Hazelcast for multi-servers, and a lot of neat things that were available that we didn't really see out of the box with OFBiz, and so we decided to kind of give it a try. And why we eventually chose Moqui was, one, open source. So that was a key driver for us. It had the modern tech stack, like I mentioned, Elasticsearch. You had to handle a multi-server type of architecture. It had a lot of kind of we didn't understand it as well in the beginning, but that strong data model, the strong built-out services, kind of out of the box. So very feature rich. It looked like OFBiz 2.0, and we also had a team that could leverage their Java knowledge. And then, I'd say not knowing what we knew at the beginning, it turns out Java wasn't a big component of building applications with Moqui. So anyways, we had this connection with David. He introduced us to Moqui, and the rest was history, if you will. So how do we use it today? Oh, it's weird. The picture's not shown here, but that's fine. So we have Moqui sitting in the middle. We leverage it for order management. We've built an application to do photography management. There's a warehousing component that we use directly from Moqui. Heavily integrations, as David alluded to earlier. Connections to 3PLs, reporting, analytics, and we kind of built out an API so that other systems can talk to us. And what do some of the integrations look like? So we have a connection with EDI. We've built out some harnesses to do CSV, XML. Shopify is a big integration that we use, and 3PLs, return solutions, and we have integrations with Locust Robotics that actually runs in our warehouse, and that's kind of an interesting story where Locust Robotics is a company that will come in and deploy robots to an existing warehouse and kind of supplement warehouse pickers. So you don't have to change much in your facility, but you just drop these guys in, and then it kind of gives you an immense amount of, output in a sense from a human perspective. So people don't have to run around as much. These robots are actually doing kind of the movement where people just kind of stay within their locations. And we have a lot of other integrations I kind of left out here, but for this particular part of the integrations, we did rely heavily on the system message kind of pattern, in a sense, where a lot of these integration points or these types are different types of system messages, and we have services that hook up to process each type of integration. So if you think about it, it works by having a service that handles, let's just say, EDI files. If you guys are familiar with them, the 850 is the order file. We have kind of a service that goes through and hooks up to the EDI file types or message types, and then a service that hooks up to process those, and it just goes in and processes it that way. And so the system message acts like our queue, and we have the kind of a robust mechanism that was already built into Moqui to handle that from a failures perspective, from operations perspective, and from a kind of integrations pattern perspective. So it was almost like a mini, enterprise service bus, if you will. For kind of warehouse management capabilities, we used it from an inventory management perspective. We do pick, pack, and ship, label printing with QZ tray, and we actually built out a custom handheld device that's kind of built on React. And how we ended up doing that, and one of the ways that we were able to do that was, Moqui has a very robust or easy to implement way of hooking up a REST API endpoint to services. So from that perspective, we were able to kind of get services hooked up and exposed to this front end application pretty easily. As far as kind of the inventory management, pick, pack, and ship capabilities, they're I would say those are areas where, I would think what we pushed, kind of some improvements in a sense of sponsoring David to make those changes. And then when we talked earlier about large installs or large scale install bases, our inventory management system was kind of a critical, I'd say, a scaling point for us as we kind of grew and records in the database grew. This was kind of a tricky piece for us to manage. So let me kind of go over that in the next bit. So how I did want to go over some of our experiences going through the journey. So we started our journey with Moqui in about, I'd say, early 2018. At the time, I think it was kind of tricky because we were making a shift from one platform to the other. So I would say we probably didn't invest enough in the beginning to understand what that learning curve looked like. So I know a lot of people kind of talk about Moqui and how easy it is to do things, and I think that's true. To make screens, to make additions, to add in services, it's pretty easy. You have to, once you kind of go through the examples and docs, it's pretty easy to do kind of common business additions or these things. However, when you get into more complex things, it gets very challenging. At least for us. I know for some others, it's not too bad of a thing for them. But one of the big things for us that we had trouble with initially was not understanding the whole kind of business process of ERP and kind of the connection points that each, I would say, each part of the business or each part of the data model connect to. So that was one of the big pieces that we did struggle with initially. And what I mean by that is it was one of those things where a lot of pieces connected to each other in ways that we didn't know. And it's mainly because we went from a system where we focused only on the e-commerce system, and in a sense, I'd say e-commerce is a little bit looser, and it's the requirements of I don't know, say data integrity and rigor were not as strong as it is in kind of the ERP perspective. So that made things challenging because we would be making changes, thinking that certain things should be happening, and lo and behold, it's connected to some other some other business process that is normal in the ERP accounting world, but unseen on the e-commerce side. So that was one of the pieces that did kind of ail us in the beginning. And I would say a little bit today still, because this whole space and things that you have to think about, it becomes pretty hard from a I'd say mental model perspective, where you have to keep a lot of things in your head to really understand them. So that, I would say, from a learning curve perspective, it was tricky. And then once you start to do other advanced things, like trying to address scaling issues, that also reared its head in a sense. So one of the things I mentioned was we use the system message queue to process our kind of integrations and things like that, which was good because, like I mentioned, it's a good mechanism where operationally you could have someone come in that's not a developer and help support the tool. from a production perspective. However, to understand the nuts and bolts of it was kind of tricky for your average developer. And once you get into scaling issues where, hey, is this job run gonna kill the server, and why is it killing it? Is it a memory issue? Is it a distributed server issue? It got kind of challenging, and trying to understand the pieces that fit together was complex, to say the least. So as I mentioned, we started off with our install, and it was a little bit of a lift and shift in some regards. What we had done was we built out our system to kind of support one brand in the beginning, and ironically, they were trying to use a lot of the capabilities that we were trying to build out with Moqui. So we're talking integration to Shopify. We're talking warehouse management. So they were going to use warehouse management within Moqui on our behalf, and and kind of the next set of features was going to be integrations to other brands as well from a Shopify perspective, and using EDI to communicate these things, these orders and inventory perspectives, where we were in the middle. And as we're kind of building out those things, we did set up a multi-server architecture in the beginning. So we're running multiple instances of Moqui, and learning the Hazelcast setup was a little bit different than, I'd say, our traditional history of our company's history of doing distributed systems or multi-tier systems. And that was a little bit challenging from our perspective, and I'd say from a lack of understanding of how that stuff works. And that in terms of scaling that piece out, I'd say we had to make some changes that are not quite in the community yet, but maybe could be at some point. And what we were noticing is, as we were doing these kind of multi-server setup, jobs running across the different servers, Hazelcast doesn't have a good mechanism to handle or load balance kind of work efforts or jobs, in a sense, from a CPU perspective. So we actually built some code that does a kind of a load-based, load-balanced executor, in a sense, that will look at what you have, what nodes are available in your cluster, and then kind of distribute it based off of what's available. I'll get to in this too. It's kind of like towards the end. I'll show you guys kind of what our infrastructure looks like, and then how we kind of split some stuff up. But in terms of scaling there, that was one of our challenges, just handling multiple servers and kind of server failures and job failures and things like that. And jobs could fail for various reasons. I mean, it could be internal bugs, cause blowing up in terms of memory, and there's also unpredictable external factors where our systems were the systems we're communicating would behave in unpredictable ways, and sometimes that's hard to account for when you're building out these integrations at kind of a quick pace, and as I alluded to earlier, we did have some database growing pains during our process, and one of the issues that we started to observe was our asset tables started to get kind of to grow rather large, and it was due to a variety of things. One is the nature of the amount of data that was coming through, but also two, when we had built certain integrations, we took we kind of made a decision to operate the data in a certain way where assets are broken up as they're kind of funneled into these robots and these business processes. So that kind of also exploded the cardinality of the data. But I would say that's a challenge that we're still kind of working through today. But it's still working as we speak. One of the things I put up on here is operational misalignment, and why I kind of wanted to put this here was the common thread that has come up on a lot of community calls, and I'd say a lot of things here, is a lot of users of the system have difficulty understanding, how things should work and the side effects of their activities. And I do recall in one of the earlier talks, we said, hey, could you use AI to do something like, hey, what does this button do if I were to press it? And that's essentially what we ran into. And a lot of times our users, internally, externally, they would just press the button without knowing what it would do. So we ran into a lot of issues where, operationally, the connection points and the effect of certain activities weren't as apparent, either by nature or just kind of just not visible to the end users. Sometimes our developers, because of how things are interconnected. So, a lot of things in Moqui happen, I would say, automatically via the SECAs, the EECAs, and all that stuff. So although those are kind of great things and good patterns to have, it does make it complicated at times to understand and debug certain activities that happen. And one of the things too, I forgot to mention from a learning curve perspective, is when we had initially set out to make the pivot to Moqui, we thought it was kind of a Java-based system, and then we quickly found out it was XML programming, for the most part, and it was a steep XML programming, but it's a majority of it is in XML. There are bits of Groovy in there, and it was steep for some of our team members to get up to speed and do some of the more complicated things. We did end up kind of having a different build pattern where we're using a lot more Groovy scripts and locations, and then the XML are just kind of definitions to the services and how it's hooked up. But to that, it is, I would say, a little bit less powerful, because with the XML screens and service definitions, you get a lot of, I'd say, batteries included features that come out when you do those, when you build in that way. And with the Groovy scripts, you kind of have to do a little bit more of your own housekeeping, in a sense. So what do we learn from that? There's a couple of things I'd say. If we had done it again, this kind of maybe the cautionary tale for the new folks deciding to jump into Moqui, how would we have done things differently? I'd say first of all, learning ERP, learning the business processes, learning about how things should behave was a critical point. So this is how orders should work, how accounting should tie into those things, how inventory management and assets are tracked, and those pieces together. Understanding that pretty well at the beginning would kind of save a lot of people headache and time, and it would make requirements gathering and implementation much smoother. So understanding the problem was understanding how things work will make understanding the problem quite a bit easier. Using less components. So one of the things that I found interesting is Moqui has a very interesting, I guess, way it's composed together. It's very nice where you have multiple components that can live in different places. However, the problem we ran into is you could potentially have these repos out of sync, and compatibility issues with different versions of different repositories. So that was one piece that was challenging. When we initially set up the project, we did almost like one component for every single integration, different implementation. So our components, they were kind of small. And I did, it was one of those things where I would say for the folks that have worked with David, sometimes it's a little tricky to pin him down to an answer. So when we initially kind of talked about this stuff, I don't think we were too confident in which way to go about building our components, and kind of said, hey, also probably because we weren't describing it in the detail he needed to provide a good answer there. But we had built out individual components for those different integration points, and like I mentioned, they ended up being small, and then it became difficult to manage from a synchronization perspective. So I would say a common pattern today with other systems and applications is they're going towards like a monorepo type of route, where everything's kind of in one place. That would probably serve you better to go with fewer components, so that you could do your builds are a little bit more atomic in a sense. And why I say that is when we started to trim it back and put other components into a singular component, it did make things a little bit easier. So we had less of the repos out of sync. Our builds were a little bit they are running better now, but in the initial days we had issues where certain versions weren't tagged right, or weren't pushed to the master correctly on those individual repos. I also want to stress having a good build system is important. So that was one of the things we did build out earlier. We used Bitbucket pipelines to handle that, which is no different than Jenkins or GitHub Actions. And having that piece put together is, I'd say, pretty critical for building out a process for your development team. Within there, we put in automated testing as part of the build, and that was kind of a great part that I'd say saved our butts a bunch of times. There's a bunch of things that kind of go in there, and it doesn't save you from everything, but at least the obvious stuff gets kind of flushed out when you kind of put this stuff together. And one of the pieces which is neat, and I don't really have this anywhere, but one of the patterns we ended up using was we have a data repo that loads last, and this one is kind of your data fixtures, and repos can have data filled in throughout them, but we have a pattern where we put certain data files, seed data files, in a repo that loads last at the time of build, so that this could kind of seed what needs to happen before your tests run and operate, and just to make sure, hey, is the system in a good state to operate. And that pattern also serves itself well for seeding your instance, so that a developer can get up and running and be productive in a very short amount of time. One of the pieces there is we did kind of separate our data files into different environments. So we'd have like a fixture or data setup for the development environment. So developers will just have to run a couple commands with the seed data specified as development, and then they'll get that experience. Production has a different set. Staging has a different set as well. And this can be, part of your build process, and get everyone up and running and connected to other systems without having to go in and do manual configurations and things like that. So that was one of the great, I'd say, benefits of how Moqi's kind of data model and robust features for kind of doing these, service-based data-based type of activities. And one of the things too is I think initially and I don't know if it's lack of time or lack of awareness, we weren't kind of in the community as much, and we weren't collaborating with lovely folks like yourselves. And I think that diving into the community is one of those pieces that would kind of accelerate someone's experience or their growth within using this platform. There's a lot of hidden things that happen that it's hard to know from documentation, from reading things, and sometimes you just have to experience it yourself, and that's where I think collaborating with people really could be a way to acquire that knowledge. And that's kind of what I had for you guys. So thanks for listening here. But I did want to show you one more thing, which was kind of our architecture and how we build this out. And I did want to. Oh, I guess it's not showing up. Give me a second. Give me a second. Let me see if I can kind of show this up to you guys. But I did want to kind of save some time so that I can answer questions about things, and if people have things that they wanted to cover, I wanted to open that up and reserve for you guys. So while I get that up, I don't know if anyone has any questions or feedback they want to hear about. I'm more than happy to talk about it.
I had a couple of thoughts as you were talking, Lawrence. The Guru Dharam just sent a thing to the chat, like use fewer components. That was something we worked on at MK.
Yeah.
It's there can be value in splitting things out across components, but mostly if there's a sufficiently isolated part of the system that a certain team is going to work on, and then they don't have to worry about stepping on toes as much. But like to your point, there are so many things that are interconnected that you often end up, unknowingly stepping on each other's toes if the code is separated too much. And then on your points about collaboration and a lot of, frankly, hidden features, and then that they're not documented. It's especially for developers, what I've come to recommend more and more over time is just spend a lot of time reading code, because it's the best source of truth, and most of the code is fairly concise, but there's a lot going on in it, and so you kind of have to go back and refer to it over and over to as you get familiar with where code lives in different places, to look up details and see what's actually happening. And I mean, I myself have to do this. There's way too much in there for me to remember everything. So I'm sure just about everyone I've worked with has had this experience where I have to say, well, let me go look that up and research it, because I don't know. And that's a matter of going back and reading code. But anyway, yeah, that's great. Thanks, Lawrence, for.
So yeah, this is just kind of give you guys a diagram of how our architecture looks. I kind of mentioned we did a couple other interesting things, and this is, I'm trying to think. We don't have this particular version in production just yet. It's kind of one of those things. It's ready to go. Our existing system, the way that we work, is we do have a job server, so one isolated server that handles jobs solely. And this is mainly because what we observed over time was if the server that distributes the job takes on jobs and the jobs fail, it's more detrimental, because then future jobs won't get scheduled, in a sense. something locks up. We ran a situation where whenever a job server was taking jobs, it would cause instability within our kind of system. So we separated that out to only scheduled jobs. The way that we currently have it is every server is homogeneous, so they're all the same. But we do assign one particular role to a job server. This is something we had to build into, I think we built it into Hazelcast or the maybe the job scheduler. I don't remember exactly where we did it, but it might be in Hazelcast. So the way Hazelcast works is there's
maybe that configuration where you disable servers from picking up jobs by I forget the setting, but basically, telling them not to pick up jobs. And
yeah. I think we had to do something a little bit more.
Something else.
Yeah, because it was we do something where, because we work in a pretty dynamic server environment, servers could go up and down all the time. So we did something where we configure it. We use an IP address. It's a little bit crude in a sense, but it kind of does its job. And mainly because our initial, I probably should have put this in the slides too, but we had originally built out everything with Elastic Beanstalk. We did use CloudFormation to build those things out, and we have moved since to Terraform. So all our other environments besides our kind of production run right now is using Terraform. So our development, staging, all that stuff is Terraform, and it looks like this here. So essentially, we have a web application tier which serves kind of the Moqui front end web traffic. And then we have workers that will handle the service jobs from the execution perspective. And then we have a job server. And these are all the same servers, but what we ended up doing is adding the capability to assign a role. And what we do from an infrastructure perspective is this is all running on ECS and essentially task for each of these three different types of things. So there's always one job server. The workers could scale up and down based on certain, I guess, metrics that we have put in place, and the same goes for the web application. So that takes in public traffic, can scale up and down, and only does that stuff, and then anything else gets shot over to the workers. And I think we did have to modify Hazelcast to do that as well. So what we're doing is looking at the role of the server that's assigned at boot up time, and then distributing it, saying, hey, I'm Hazelcast, I got a job as a distributed executor. Which servers are available for me to look at? And then we used our load balancing logic to pick within the pool that has the assigned roles. So anyways, that's
quick question on that, Lawrence. When you say modify Hazelcast, was that the Moqui Hazelcast component, or did you actually have to get down into Hazelcast itself and muck around with some things?
So initially, it was almost mucking around in Hazelcast, and it was one of those things where it got pretty tricky to do that, and then that makes your build process quite complicated. I ended up figuring out we could just do, what do? We did, I'm kind of looking through our code real quick. We did change, it is the Moqui Hazelcast component. And we added, I think it was something, some type of wrapper. Okay. We did an executor, we extended the executor service proxy and essentially overwrote some of the functions within I guess Hazelcast.
Override some of their
yeah. So the particular one that was critical was the one called get next. Oh wait, no, I'm sorry. We overwrote essentially the submit, kind of anything that Hazelcast used to submit to the executor. So this would be submit for future jobs, executing right away, those type of things, and then we broke it, kind of override it so that there's a point that says, hey, instead of doing Hazelcast's normal activity, which they just, if I looked at the code, and like you mentioned, digging in the code is the best way to learn some of the stuff. That I think when I looked at the Hazelcast code, they don't really do anything that I think it's random, either random or maybe in order or something. I don't remember exactly anymore. But what we do is, hey, select my member within the pool, the Hazelcast pool, and we have the logic to say, hey, which one is the next best one, and then it goes and grabs that and sends the job to that.
Looks like Matt had a question or comment.
Yeah. Hey, Matt.
Hi, great presentation. Thank you. I wanted to ask a little more about you. You mentioned building more tests, and you mentioned some XML components that you were loading to do some of those tests early on in the process. But I wondered if you could explain a little more about those. To give you a background, when we were with OFBiz, one of the things that we found helpful, especially when we were working on converting data from another system, we found it really helpful to have some kind of SQL sanity check kinds of processes that looked for records that didn't comport very well with the Silverstone model, and so we would run that nightly, in fact, just to make sure that we weren't pulling in records that were broken in some fashion. I'm wondering, when you were talking about building more tests, I'd like more examples of the XML load kinds of tests that you were talking about. Also wondering whether you were doing like Selenium based web tests, or what kinds of tests have you found helpful in your development process?
So it's interesting. I think initially what's funny is not funny, but I'd say actually one of the big selling points, I probably should put this in the presentation as well. The Moqui had a lot of integration tests already in place, and it had a good framework to run test. So, it's the other thing is when you our previous environment, we didn't have a lot of automated tests. We had some, but not a lot. And the infrastructure made it kind of hard to do a lot. With Moqui, it was pretty easy. So we, like any new shiny toy, we're like, hey, let's do unit tests for everything. So we started off doing unit tests, and it was great. It was fun. It was great to okay, this validates kind of how our data would come into the system from a unit and atomic level. But what we, it's one of those things where you wonder how far David is thinking ahead, because what we finally realized is okay, well, hey, doing these integration tests actually worked out better because you're exercising a lot of features within the system inherently just by nature of doing these things. So I would say integration tests was one of the pieces that I would say to invest more in, and testing from us, what you're describing, Matt, it sounds like it's more data validation and integrity as things come into the system. Those could be potentially tested beforehand, and how you could do that is possibly building tests where I don't know. You could do stuff, if you want to do it programmatically, you could do services that kind of randomly generate data in certain ways and make sure that your system handles those scenarios properly, either by omitting them or making sure or alerting the team appropriately, or work on building tests from a defined perspective to exercise the services that are kind of critical to the system. So maybe I'll describe what we had evolved to in some regards. I would say it got to a point where I think Shopify didn't like some of the things we were doing initially, but what we had done was we have our Shopify integration, and that pulls down orders, does fulfillments, and does inventory and things like that. So we built some harnesses and automated tests, and this doesn't show up in the pipeline, but this is kind of a different type of testing strategy, but it does play into the whole data loading perspective. So we have a development environment, say, of Shopify, and then we have the credentials and all that stuff in the seed data. And then what we do is, as we set up a system, we have jobs that are automatically enabled where it creates orders into Shopify. And this is, we're using kind of like random data generation tools where it'll create essentially fake customer data that looks real. And we're pushing it into the system up there. And then we're exercising our integration, pulling it back down and making sure those activities work. Sometimes that's doable. Another approach is you can create data fixtures from that perspective, and that would get loaded up into kind of your data, either whatever component it is that you put in the data file, and then you'd load those kind of predefined patterns, and then you would exercise that within the test suite. So those are a couple of patterns that we've done. So we do that from like a CSV perspective. We probably should do it from a EDI perspective as well. But those are, I'd say, good ways to approach that.
One of the things that we've found is that there are certain kinds of human errors that are kind of predictable. Somebody enters a wrong year, for example. Current data should follow very predefined patterns, and we found that at least in OFBiz, it really helped to have some better checking in place, because it seemed like OFBiz wasn't nearly as good as Moqui at keeping the data consistent and flagging errors and some of those kinds of things. But I haven't bothered to do a SQL sanity check on Moqui the way I did on OFBiz. Are you doing things of that nature, or is it pretty much at load time you're
Matt, yeah,
checking
so Matt, you're talking about like runtime auditing sorts of tests.
Yeah, kind of.
Then,
yeah.
And I guess what Lawrence was talking about mostly was the tests as part of the development and deployment process.
In the integration
operations,
yeah.
And integrations and new code and all this sort of thing. So when he was talking about unit tests and integration tests, those are terms like unit tests, and these are all service level tests. So Matt, you were asking earlier about Selenium, so those would be UI level tests, but most of the internal testing stuff in Moqui is focused on the service level, where it's a little bit easier to test and validate logic and data and such. And then hopefully the screens are using the services consistently, and so any problems that might come up in the screens will show there. So a unit test would be something like testing a single service, whereas an integration test would call a number of different services and make sure that what happens during the process of calling those services and the end result is what is expected. So that's what he means by an integration test. But yeah, data validation, with some of the and runtime auditing, some of the tricky things there, and yeah, hopefully you don't run into as many issues with Moqui because of certain things like well, like for GL posting, it's fairly strict about posting to close periods and stuff. So
Right.
if you kind of keep your periods closing over time, then a big funny date will result in a transaction that can't be posted. So it'll end up in the error journal, and someone will notice it sooner or later. And then operationally, rather than doing, and Matt, you probably remember over time we added a bunch of these, but instead of having kind of separate queries that you run, there are some screens in the accounting reports to do certain reconciliations or audits that check for data inconsistency, transactions that aren't posted, or invoices that don't match what's in the GL, or payments that don't match what's in the GL, or all of those sorts of things. So yeah, those are certainly a challenge, because data entry errors kind of cascade down as things progress. So if you have a data entry error in an order, then the shipment created from it's going to have that error, and the invoice is going to have that error, and then the GL is going to have that error, and then it ends up being a bit of a mess. But yeah, which I think that's kind of mainly what you're talking about, Matt.
Yeah, I was just curious, when he was talking about the XML load tests, that was an area that I had not focused on before. So I wanted to learn more about that, what kinds of tests they were doing at that level, and some of that kind of thing.
So to clarify, Lawrence, I guess when you're talking about all the data stuff, that's where you're generating data for testing purposes. So you don't have to use real production data and stuff. That was the idea.
Two parts. So that's one aspect, or it could also be loading data from external systems potentially. But in reality, it's a data fixture. So it's it is definitely more static in nature in some regards. But sometimes that's what you need. It's like saying, hey, my service will always handle an order that looks like this, and then if anything down the road, changes, then you'll be notified kind of quickly, and your feedback cycle will be a little bit faster, and from a functional level too. So I think for a system like Moqui, where there's a lot of higher level business process and functions, integration tests make a lot of sense, because that gives you a lot of coverage without having to go down to each individual kind of function and test their input and output. You get it somewhat for free, but you also get it from a behavioral perspective when you're doing these integration tests. I kind of feel like that's what, David, you intended for when you built a lot of these Spock tests. And
that's the idea, and partly because the issue with ERP systems is not that you have individual bits of logic that are very complex and that tend to have a lot of issues. It's like a death by 1,000 cuts sort of thing, because you've got hundreds of services and they all kind of need to work together properly and keep data consistent, or you run into issues. So yeah.
One of the pieces I forgot to, I had in my notes, but I forgot to talk about this, was reporting and kind of the analytics stuff had become tricky over time, just based on the amount of data records that we kind of accumulated. I was going to say one of the things that Moqui does have that we don't leverage enough is the data document. Using that more to tailor our kind of data structure so that we can retrieve it better. That's one mechanism to do it. And we actually
mean like sending to Elasticsearch or some other like data warehouse for analytics purposes.
Correct. And that's the second piece of it is, and there's probably an opportunity to build some component that does a kind of automatic ETL, so that it could flow into a data warehouse for more from the business analytics side. And this is, I don't know if this resonates with Matt well, but it's one of those things where it's like, hey, I want to know how many shipments went out at a particular time, type of thing like that. And then to do those queries on when you're getting millions of records, it does get quite tricky because of the way the indexes of the system works. And it could mainly be because we operate in a multi-tenant environment. So we have this kind of another layer we have to segregate the data by. But
or multi-organization, you mean?
sorry, multi-organization. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's certainly easy to bring the system to its knees with a query that
So
has a lot of joins or things of that nature.
yeah, when it has a lot of joins. So an
Yeah.
example too, I was just thinking about from the assets perspective, the asset records are always retained within Moqui, which is great from a history tracking perspective. It gets tricky when you're trying to see, hey, what's in stock? What's available? And then there's, for an example, to go through that data on the screens, and I don't know if it's already built in there, but if you're doing the raw queries, if you're trying to select all the products or assets from a particular organization, you're going to get a lot of records over time. But if you were to do another filter where you say, okay, well, just show me everything with the on hand greater than 0, that significantly reduces that kind of amount of records you'd have to go through, and then you can kind of further split that stuff up. We've actually had other needs where I think Moqui has a capability of actually looking at what your inventory is at a particular point in time using the asset detail table. So you can kind of like calculate backwards, how much you had, or from that perspective. But that is computationally expensive, and if you want to do it on all your products, it's kind of crazy. So we had to build some things where we do that, batch it and store it, and then the downside there is you end up storing a lot of extra data. But if that's something that the business needs, then you kind of you're gonna have to figure out how to solve it for them.
Yeah, creating kind of summary data is what you're talking about there. And so you don't have to hit all those asset detail records for every little thing. Yeah.
And from a warehouse, the other thing I think that's come up a couple times is kind of the asset reservation system, and the fulfillment aspect of it has been it's a harder concept to grasp for newer folks that have worked with with simpler warehouse management interfaces. So a lot of people coming into Moqui with a different experience, they kind of struggle a little bit with the asset concept and reservations and things like that. So it gets tricky for them. And then from a user perspective, there's a lot of exposure or areas where they can do things that have unintended consequences that they I guess they would expect something else. It's the feature or bug type of dilemma. So it's there's a lot of traps there that you don't know about, and it would be interesting. It would be interesting to have a little help button with AI saying that could tell you what happens when you press that. So.
Yeah, asset reservation is a tricky area, and it gets a lot trickier when you have lot numbers or heaven forbid serialized inventory.
Right, and that's the other thing too is I think Moqui does a good job at the common case, or but some of those other scenarios makes it. I don't know. It's mainly because I don't live that yet, and I don't know how managing serial numbers could operate more efficiently.
Well, good. Did anyone else have any questions? I guess it's probably about time to close this session, and then we'll have lightning talks coming up next.
I was wondering, David, if we might, and I already asked him, and he's okay if we start in like 5 minutes from now, but if we move Eamon up in the light and talks a little bit later.
Sure.
Unless there's something real specific that we want to jump into with them.
I think for each of us, I'll go ahead and stop the recording in this session.